To those who could make it this evening, I have to say once again how sorry I am for not having been there last time. I was not feeling very well, um, but I feel well enough now to hold the lecture. As I promised last time, tonight we will go a bit deeper into the question of technology and eschatology, which I started, um, um, let's say, developing last time. I would like to look into that relationship, in fact, between technology, ecology, and eschatology, if only because, as I said early on, our epoch can be characterized, in fact, as one of technological escalation. Technological escalation, I'll give you two examples. Technological escalation in the sense that the interface between biological life and technology is exponentially expanding. For instance, the last century, 20th century, has seen a steep uptick in the use of biotechnical instruments of all kinds, in fact. Technologies that affect the minds, they affect the bodies of humans, as well as things like the inner composition of plants, things like the inner composition of bacteria, or the inner composition, for that matter, of animals. We have seen also the extent to which hormonal disruptors or hormonal enhancers, immunizers, plant and insect modifiers, and the like, we have seen how they have woven the endocrine, the nervous, immune, and neurological systems of biological organisms into the fabric of the technosphere. So, to some extent, I think we can safely argue that biotechnical infrastructures are increasingly reorganizing the boundaries of biochemical life on Earth. So that's one dimension in which what I call technological escalation has proceeded. But there are many other dimensions. We simply have to look into the ways in which computing software is increasingly the first driver transforming logistics infrastructures. Logistics infrastructures are absolutely key to the process of planetarization, which is spearheaded to a large extent by capitalism. So we see, for instance, how software has drastically reduced the need for human oversight in all kinds of documenting, of sorting, of organizing activities. And with ongoing improvements in data analytics, new users have expanded, and they now include things like intelligent actions such as object recognition, such as profiling, such as predictive logics. All of that is going on. And one can go as far as to argue that, in fact, software's coded possibilities have progressed from electronic messages and automatic signals to a full-blown cognitive unconscious. A cognitive unconscious that is able to bond space with all manners of coded intelligence. This is the case, for instance, in robotic technologies, which are, by the way, potentially, I would say, game-changing. They are game-changing, if only because they are able to aggregate for the first time a wide array of smart capabilities which range from sensors, prosthetics, to algorithmic logic, to machine learning, to cloud computing. And they not only appropriate code on a far larger magnitude than before, they also do so in ways that mimic humans in terms of their adaptability to, I would say, to non-repetitive situations and capacities for actuation. So you can see through some of these examples how it is that technological escalation is becoming a hallmark of the times we live in, or in any case, of the 21st century. Now, it's not just that the epoch is characterized by technological escalation. It is that technological escalation itself is coupled with the transformations of capitalism. So when you put together technological escalation and the transformations of capitalism, you see clearly that this coupling has led to what I would call a twofold excess. An excess of something the Greeks used to call pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, which was the Greek word for breath. It's a word, a concept that was used in particular in Greek science, of course, but also in Greek theology. So it has the word pneuma, breath, has this double dimension of a process that can be described because it has some, not mechanical, but at least some organic dimensions. But pneuma, breath, was also used, as I'm saying, in theological parlance as the equivalent of, let's just call it for the time being, a soul, of that which provides the kind of of air, of breath that is necessary for any living entity to actually stay alive. Because the moment you stop breathing, then life processes are somewhat interrupted. So pneuma, in this sense, has some connection with what we could call today vitalism. So an excess of vitalism that, in fact, these double transformations of capitalism and technology have resulted in what could be considered to be an excess of vitalism, an excess of pneuma. So you have this excess of pneuma on the one hand, and on the other hand, an excess of artifacts, of tools. Artifacts themselves being increasingly transformed into pneuma, meaning artifacts being more and more no longer the inanimate objects they used to be, but artifacts acquiring more and more in and of themselves, being infused the kind of vitality that we thought only pertained to the domain, let's say, of the divine, to push it simply. So, for instance, you have a cell phone. The cell phone here is not just a dead object, far from that. It is a very living object, living object in and of itself, in the sense that it has a form, it has a duration, it's meant to exist for a certain amount of time, after which it becomes obsolescent, it has to be replaced. But inside it are a set of inscribed within it, a set of potentialities we can activate by, of course, browsing our phone, using our fingers, and in the process, unleashing a whole set of mechanics, embarking in a whole set of journeys that are susceptible to take us out of ourselves and set us on an itinerary that is somewhat endless. That we open the phone, we Google, we go to places we have never imagined. It's astonishing the kind of life that is inscripted inside the object, which animates the object, but animates us too. So in that sense, one can argue that in this case, the artifact is turning into pneuma. That part of what we are witnessing is precisely the becoming animate of the inanimate, of the dead object. So as you can see, what I'm saying is that nothing translates this double excess better than the techno-digital universe. The techno-digital universe, which to a large extent has become the double of our earth, the double of our world. That we are standing, I mean, I don't know, Fernando, you are sitting there, Katerina, the same thing, or Nabil, or Adnan, You're sitting somewhere, I don't know where, but you are sitting in a house, you are sitting on a chair, you are grounded. And yet, you are here with me, I'm sitting somewhere else. And we are communicating across what looks like long distances. And Katrina might be in Europe. If I were to fly where she is now, it would take me at least 12 hours in the plane. And yet, through our encounter in the techno-digital universe, I don't need those 12 hours. I don't need an airplane. The connection is instantaneous, if you want. There's no second, no split second, in case we want to communicate. So it seems to me then that this excess of artifacts and this excess of pneuma, nothing translates it better than this digital universe, which has become already the double of our Earth and of our world, a world which expands, of course, beyond the actual physical Earth, since artifacts now populate other planets too. In fact, other planets are increasingly, becoming the dumping ground of the excess of artifacts we have on Earth. So, in fact, it is possible to go further and to argue that one of the most distinctive characteristics of contemporary humanity is to constantly traverse screens, that we spend most of our days in front of screens. And we do not simply watch our screens passively. In fact, what is going on is that we traverse them. We enter into them and we are moved, we undertake a kind of movement which is not physical except indirectly, but we are moved, we are in motion the moment we enter the screen and we begin to cross it and to survey it. So one of the most distinctive characteristics of contemporary humanity is indeed to constantly traverse screens, to constantly be immersed, it's really immersion, immersed in image machines, and image machines which are at the same time dream machines. So you see the connection I'm trying to make here, following in particular the work of historians who have done studies on ancient Greece. I have in mind the work of Jean-Pierre Vernant, for instance, and the extent to which they have helped us to have to develop a phenomenological understanding of the image. The image as not only that reflection of the real onto another kind of real or another kind of artifact, but the image as that which opens the door to the dream world. So you have these machines, therefore, that are not only producing dreams, but also putting all kinds of dreams at our disposal that we can access them, we can inhabit them, or let ourselves be inhabited by that other part of the real, which cannot be touched, which is fictional, if you want, and yet not less efficacious. Let's just put it like that. So the peculiarity of the image one is talking about here is that these images are animated. I just want you to keep in mind that concept of animus, of animation, that which is different from something else, some other reality that would be inert. You have in a stone, you have a stone, full stop. A mountain, you have a mountain. A mass of rocks and maybe some vegetation. Of course, the rock is alive, is itself the product of the kind of geological life that produced it. But at least apparently it is inert. Now the image is something else, is moving, constantly moving, as we learned from Deleuze. I mean, Deleuze work on cinema, the 2 volumes, I think, tell us a lot about the capacity of the image to animate and to be animated in turn. So this question of animus, animation, animism, to which I'll come a little later. So when we say images move or images are animated, we partly mean that they produce all kinds of illusions, all kinds of fantasies, key of which is the fantasy of self-generation, of self-aggrandizement, of self-enhancement, but above all, the images, enable, in our contemporary condition, they enable new forms of presence and circulation. I was talking about presence a moment ago. Presence in the sense we are present here, we are assembled as I speak. We form an assembly, of course, that is, let's say, requires physical presence. We all have to stop whatever we're doing before 7 o'clock. We have to assemble somewhere, not necessarily in the same place, which used to be the case before the new technologies we are using now. Assembly necessitated a co-presence that was physical. As Judith Butler talks about this in her book on assembly, which was written, I think, before, let's say, no, it wasn't before, but she's still, let's say, invoking assembly in the old sense, in the pre-digital sense, because it seems to me that the fact of assembling, or the fact of assemblage, of co-presence, operates nowadays in a way that was not at all the same as, let's say, early 20th century or late 19th century. But that's another matter. Whatever the case, these are artifacts that enable new forms of presence, new forms of circulation too, new forms of incarnation and reincarnation, new forms of resurrections too. For instance, this afternoon, I was watching a Congolese artist who died 4 or 5 years ago. He was giving a concert in an important dancing hall somewhere in France. And the concert was recorded, of course. So I was sitting in front of my screen, watching him, listening to him, watching his movements, seeing him dancing, being alive. But in fact, he's dead. In fact, he's no longer alive in the sense in which he would be here now, doing exactly that, although being recorded. So he's physically dead, organically dead, but he's still alive through the ensemble of images that were recorded of him, which allow him to reincarnate himself long after his death and to represent himself once again to us. So the point I want to make through this argument is that, in fact, not only technology has become theology, it has also become eschatology. And that's the point I would like to develop then tonight. To what extent can we argue that technology partakes nowadays of both theology and eschatology? It has become so if we look at it from a phenomenological perspective. We have come to this because in the technological universe of the now, it is not only possible to split oneself into two or many. It is not only possible to exist in more than one place at a time and in more than one body at a time, in more than one flesh. In fact, it is possible to have doubles. That is, other selves across, I would say, between the person's own physical body and the image of the person's body on the screen. So, traversing screens has become the primary activity of contemporary humanity, in the sense that it authorizes us to exit bodily boundaries. It authorizes us to plunge into all sorts of parallel worlds, to be present to ourselves, while simultaneously keeping a distance from ourselves. So it opens up entirely new possibilities. Let's say the phenomenology, the whole phenomenology of presence and absence couldn't allow us to experiment with. Thus, the other hypothesis I would just like to put to you, which has to do then with the swing into animism. So I told you about a key marker of our time, technological escalation, as you see, what I have been trying to do is to show to what extent this technological escalation goes hand in hand with what I call the swing into animism. And I have been bringing it, this concept of animism, under different guises since I started talking under the guise of the pneuma, of the breath, under the guise of the distinction between that which is inert and that which is animate, under the guise of moving images borrowed partly from Deleuze, and now in the full-blown form of the swing to animism. Animism, in what sense? Animism in the sense that a vast reconfiguration of the human and its relationship with the living world, what I have been calling through this seminar, le vivant. So a reconfiguration of those relationships with the living world is unfolding in front of our own eyes. This is what I have called the second creation. Now you'll ask me, but what do you mean by the second creation? By second creation, I mean the attempt to technologically capture the energy of the living world, capturing it and downloading it or transferring its attributes into artificial components, but artificial components which are endowed essentially with the characteristics of the human person. So you see it's not the mechanics, but the process of capture, which goes hand in hand with extraction. In our case, of course, the extraction of data, the sorting of data, the storing of data, the interpretation of data too, but via intelligent machines, less and less via human reason. So you have all of that process of capturing, of downloading, of transferring into artificial components, intelligent, they would say nowadays, components, which themselves are, as I have just said, endowed with the characteristics of the human person, which opens up, of course, the possibility of a fusion, or in any case, a hybridization of the human and the machine. Something which has, as you know, been the big dream of technological civilizations. To take from the human the best of the human, merge it with the best of the machine, and in the process produce an augmented, let's say, individual, but an individual who synthesizes, a synthetic individual who reconciles the power of the machine and the intelligence and rationality of the human. This being perceived, of course, as the next phase of human evolution. From the moment the human emerged in Africa, stood up which was a big marker of the liberation of the hands, of the brain, and started making tools as an extension of himself or herself. So the idea is that that evolutionary process is far from having reached its end, and that it will probably move to the next stage when indeed the marriage of the human and the artifact is signed and it is celebrated. And many do believe, therefore, that we are at the cusp of that next step in human evolutionary history. And that, in fact, the new technologies that are being invented at a pace we have never seen before, our inhabitation of these artifacts is turning us into an entirely different kind of the human, different from, for instance, the human of the 18th century, who was believed to be endowed, or at least some of them were believed to be endowed with the faculty of reason, which the faculty of language, reason, which distinguished them from each other and from the rest of the species. So it seems to me then that one way to develop a critique of technology today is to do it exactly in the direction I'm suggesting. So these components, I told you about the components which are supposed to be endowed with the characteristics of the human person. These components are called upon to operate as human doubles. Human doubles. So while in the past, animism was considered a relic of the obscurantism of so-called primitive societies, now animism is compatible with artificial intelligence. It is compatible with supercomputers. It is compatible with nanorobots, artificial neutrons, RFID chips, and even telepathic brains. So you see that animism is nowadays, as I told you, first of all, before, it was thought to be the way in which primitive societies misrepresent themselves, misrepresent the world surrounding them, and enter into magical relationships with that world and its components. Believing, for instance, that a stone can speak, a tree can bark, attributing agency to what in the so-called modern logic didn't have any agency of its own, was acted upon. The principal agent, the sole agent, in fact, agency being the attribute of the human, and everything else being acted upon. So primitive animism, in fact, didn't share such a vision of existence. Rather, it developed a vision of existence in which agency was always distributed. It was distributed among humans, animals, organic, vegetal, mineral actants, to use a term new ontology likes a lot, actants. So now contemporary animism is not exactly going back to where animism left it all, but it is trading precisely on the same paths. So it is as if with the cyberneticization of the world, both the human and the divine or the animate were downloaded into a multiplicity of tech objects, of interactive screens, of physical machines. And these objects have become, I think, genuine crucibles in which visions and beliefs, the contemporary metamorphoses of faith, are forged. So from this standpoint, I would say that contemporary technological forms of dreaming are expressions of animism. That's the point I make. We can debate it later if you want. But they also differ from it in as much as they are governed by the principle of artifice, whereas ancestral animism was governed by that of vital force. So I'm trying to show here to what extent is it that the animistic paradigm helps us to understand the ontology of contemporary tech objects, and yet I'm also trying to show the extent to which the logic behind new tech objects differs somewhat from the logic of agency, which in the animistic paradigm was attributed to non-humans. In the animistic paradigm, the principle was that of vital force, whereas today the principle is that of artifice. That's also a differentiation we can get back to later if you want. Now let me go back to the question of pneuma, of air, of animism, of breathing, because you see the term animate, animus, animism, in fact, keeps bringing us back to one key concept, which is the concept of air. Air, or more generally, concept of atmosphere. Now, when we look at forms of ancestral animism, especially African forms of animism, one thing can be immediately highlighted. This has to do with the fact that in ancestral animism, neither body nor life existed without air. I'm really taking you now into the deep metaphysics, deep African pre-colonial metaphysics, where in fact, body, life cannot be dealt with separately, cannot be understood as autonomous entities unless we factor in air. Unless we factor in water, unless we factor in some kind of common ground, some form of common earth on which we stand. We don't in the ocean, we are not floating. We are standing on a piece of ground, a piece of earth, which is common. So life, body, and consequently the human were fundamentally open to air. They were fundamentally open to breath, to water, to fire, to dust, to wind, to trees and their vegetations. They were fundamentally open to animals, to the nocturnal world. So a form of radical openness which allowed precisely the body to connect somewhat with its environment, its total ecology, and to resonate and vibrate with it, resonate to it, meaning let itself be absorbed by its movements, its sounds, its colors, and let itself be animated by what surrounded it. And in so doing, weave connections with it. Let itself be crushed by it. So, what I mean by that is that everything was alive. That was the belief. And when we look at that archive, we not forget about, but we move away somewhat from one form of archive and we open up another one, in this case, the old African archive, we begin to encounter a different ontology, different narrative of being and of existence, in which, therefore, everything is alive, in which everything is at the intersection of languages. So what you see here is the assumption that, in fact, porosity, essential porosity, is what makes the human. It is what makes the human, and it is what also makes the human's essential fragility. That the human is not super powerful. That in fact, the human is fundamentally fragile, fundamentally open to the world at large. And it was also thought in these African pre-colonial metaphysics that the human adventure on earth, what we call history, our adventure on earth, is played out in the reality of air and breath, rather than in the reality of massive structures, monumental structures, destined to live ad vitam aeternam. It resides in reality in our ways of absorbing and releasing air and breath. In that thing that is not really corporeal, is not physical, you can't see it. You can feel it. You can, when you breathe, I mean, you exhale and you inhale, exhale on your arm and you can feel the air, but you can't touch it. You can't see it. And yet it is there. In its fugitivity, if you want. So fragility, fugitivity, and yet this is called upon to continue to, because when it stops, that's it. It has to last. And this, it was believed, could only last if a place was made for the regeneration of vital cycles. You have to constantly regenerate it, incessantly engage in the labor of unfinished, interminable labor of regeneration. The interminable labor of regeneration, meaning the labor of assembling together absolutely everything. So what we have here is a principle very different from what I told you early on, where we have an excess, excessiveness. Excess is the norm. Excess of artifacts, excess of everything. In African pre-colonial metaphysics, we are dealing with a matter of composition and not excessiveness or excess. It's how you compose, how you assemble different things, all of them differentially fragile, and how you orchestrate them for the benefit of the regeneration of life cycles. So as you can see, I mean, you can deduce yourself some of the conclusions. We don't have in this matrix a human who is sitting on top of everything, extracting whatever he can from the rest of the living, and who doesn't matter at all about the consequences of this endless process of extraction, of exploitation. We have an entirely different paradigm where you compose with the rest of the living and you compose with them for the purpose of regeneration. Of what? Of the life cycles. So that's one, let's say, a set of observations I wanted to share. Now, of course, one can argue that my insisting on technological escalation is, or anyway, technological escalation is not new. As such, it is not new. And this is true. But it seems to me that the pace of advancement has clearly accelerated in recent decades. And there are a number of examples to buttress this. I think I shared some of them last time when we spoke about platform capitalism. Platform capitalism, a kind of capitalism in which the market has not only become a totality, or in any case is aspiring to become a totality, but platform capitalism as having become our core moral experience, just as technology. So I don't think I should spend more time making that point. But I would just like to remind us of one or two points concerning, of course, this kind of infrastructure that for the conduct of late modern life, which platform capitalism has become the embodiment of. Now, when we say platform capitalism, in fact, there's not just one single form of platform, there are many. The service platform, for example, such as Uber. You have the goods platform, for example, Amazon. You have the information platform, exemplified by Google. So you have different platforms. And when I mention Uber, I could have mentioned others. When I mention Amazon, I mention Google. These are, of course, three different entities. But they have a number of things in common. And I would like to highlight three of these common characteristics. First of all, what unites them, these three different platforms, is the way that they capture value. They capture value from the transmissions, from the interactions of digital media and technologies. I mentioned the capture of value. I should add the capture of data. You can begin to see the relationship I'm trying to weave between data and value. So every time we shop with Amazon, we are producing data. The data is not out there, we produce it. But we are not paid for producing data. We are producing data as a market commodity. Of course, you still have coffee, raw materials, cocoa, for which we need to carve out chunks of the forest. We still have that, those commodities. But data is becoming increasingly a core commodity. So what I mean is that as users, we are integral components in the platform's integrated infrastructure. We might not know it, or we might not think about it, but we are put to work for the circulation of data. We are permanently put to work. Every time we open our computer or engage in a number of related activities, we are not only working for ourselves, we are being put to work by these visible or invisible monopolies. So that's one feature the different platforms have in common. The second feature is that platforms are like multi-sided markets, not just business to consumer, not just business to business, but user to user too. So a multi-sided market. And they are not only or simply channels for communication. Of course, they are, but not only. They also actively compel, they construct, they configure the way that users, data, and commodities are on the move or in motion. So this element of circulation I was referring to earlier on. So to a large extent, platform or digital capitalism must be understood along the three axes I have referred to. First, a digital ecosystem or environment. Two, a system of transactions. And third, an existential and experiential order. And as such, it is a collection of processes, of course, moments in which digital technology then mediates the structural tendencies of capitalism. It organizes, it executes movements that are tailored to the structural needs of capital. And in turn, capital as a process and as an expression of value entails the continuous translation of value into different forms, such as money, such as labor. I already mentioned commodity. And of course, communication is vital to this process of circulation, conversion, and so forth, and so on. So there would be a lot to say if one wanted, in fact, to give an account of the effects of speed and technology on contemporary social existence and moral and political experience. But let me simply highlight two things. The first is that key to the operations of the platforms, as I argued, is the mobilization of data. In the sense that the mobilization of data has become an essential part of the circulation of capital. Now, I've been talking about data. The fact with data is that data themselves are mobile, they are fleeting, and yet their effects are lasting. In fact, data is constructed for movement. That's the peculiarity of this kind of commodity. It wouldn't have any value if it couldn't move at high speed, because the other commodities move. I mean, you cut, you import, you extract oil in the Gulf of Guinea, you have to transport it. It has to move. But there are differentials in various infrastructures of speed. Data moves faster in any case than any other commodity. So the second thing I want to highlight is that it is not enough to account for the way that data move. We must also understand that the most important configuration of data mobility is the achievement of scale, the achievement of speed, I mentioned it, fast, really fast, and agility. Which means what? Which means that data platforms are at their most profitable, they are at their most efficient when they are handling large amounts of data. And when large amounts of data move quickly. That's when they are at their most profitable and most efficient. So all of this is actually going on. All of this is going on in the sense that technology is impacting many domains of our existence. I could add plenty of examples, gene editing, for instance, and gene editing tools are promising designer babies. We are spending our lives mediated more by information media than ever before. But what I would like to draw attention to now is to the set of beliefs which nowadays underlie much of technological culture. Key among which is the belief that reality is informational. Key is also, that's the first, key is also the belief that human beings are nothing but information and hence can be manipulated by our desires. Those two key beliefs are, it seems to me, at the foundation of contemporary technological culture. Now, this is a very tricky terrain, and I'll try to go into it step by step. Because the last 2 centuries of technological development, if we examine them carefully, we'll discover that they have gone hand in hand with cultural representations of that development, cultural representations in the form of, let's just call it technological futurism. And it is this question of technological futurism, of the possibilities of technology, that I would now like to examine. And I would like to do that by highlighting, first of all, a few key points. The first is that utopian thinking has been a key dimension of technological imagination, at least over the last 200 years. In fact, when we review the history of this utopian thinking, it's easy to remark the extent to which it reveals the close relationship between technology and religion in general. When we go looking into the history of this utopian thinking, it appears almost immediately that, in fact, it has something to do with religion in general, and that, I mean, a lot of people have written about this. So that's the first remark around technology, religion, technology as a religion, or the religion of technology. All of that resulting from a form of thinking that has been characterized as utopian. The second comment I would like to make has to do with an element that has deeply marked Western culture, something that has to do with the theologies of the future, or with futurism as such. You see, maybe, I mean, I'm engaging in some rather flimsy comparison. Part of what distinguishes quote unquote Western culture from other cultures is the place it has granted to the idea of the future as a key element of its identity. Not every single human culture has given such a role to the future in its imagination. Now, of course, in the West, here again, it's a rather quick reference. Let's say we find a distinction that is made between two competing conceptions of the future. They are prevalent in Western thought, two competing conceptions of the future. You have the future on the one hand, which is thought or viewed as solely and entirely driven by what precedes it. So that's one concept of the future. And on the other hand, you have the future as a radical openness to the arrival of things and not solely or entirely the product of what has come before. I don't know whether you follow. On the one hand, the future as entirely and solely driven by what precedes it, meaning what came before. Let's just call it the past. The past, the future is the result of the past. Is the recapitulation of the past. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, the future as a radical openness to the arrival of things. A kind of radical future of which, for instance, Ernst Bloch speaks about in his various tomes, The Principle of Hope. That you don't know what is coming. You don't know when it is coming, but you know that something will come. And therefore, the task of the historical individual is to dispose oneself to that which is coming, that which is always ahead of oneself. And so when we say radical openness, it is in that sense. It might or might not arrive. That doesn't matter. What matters is to to cultivate the predispositions to its potential happening. Either in the now or in the next, let's say, temporal configuration. As you can see, the future as radical openness takes form, it takes shape in context of faith. You have to believe that it will happen. Something will happen. In a context of faith, it took shape, if you want to be a bit more historical, it's a Judeo-Christian trope, if you want, which took shape when the so-called people of God seemed to be at their wits' end with all their power, their strength, their ability to effect real change, completely impossible. So it has to do with future with the question of possibility, the dialectics of possibility and impossibility. So the future then seemed impossible given the present circumstances, and yet the hope for something beyond all possibilities was nurtured. The belief being that unforeseen interventions from God do happen. So you are right here in the midst of faith, in the midst of hope. And in this radical concept of the future, what we see is that history is interrupted by something that is either internal or external to nature, to creation, to society. And the future in this sense is akin to a narrative, but a narrative that represents an interruption of the narrative. That's what it is. So they see the paradox. A narrative that interrupts the narrative, that represents an interruption of the narrative. In any case, a disruption of the environment or conditions of the story itself. It's a very powerful story, that kind of story that represents an interruption of the story or a disruption in the conditions of the story itself. And yet it is still a story of hope. So that's the radically unforeseen future. Now, for those of you who have studied somewhat, are familiar with the transhumanist literature, the transhumanist texts of the likes of Ray Kurzweil, of Martin Rees, of Nick Bostrom. Of course, when you look at those texts, they are texts of different nature, but they are all underpinned, I would argue, by a set of thinkings and beliefs. At least three basic belief foundations. They are underpinned here again by an overriding importance of the question of the future in these transhumanist texts. They keep coming back to the idea of the malleability of humanity, malleability through both biological and technological evolution. And lastly, the view that the future is entirely a product of the past. So you see those three tropes. Some put an insistence on one trope more than on others, but those are the three tropes that underpin that body of texts, transhumanist texts. What I mean by that is that, in fact, a number of contemporary narratives of the technological imagination and religion overlap. They overlap thematically. They overlap on the idea of salvation. Salvation in the sense of the overcoming of death through technology. They overlap thematically on the idea of transcendence. Transcendence referring here to the surpassing of human limitations. And they overlap around the theme of transition, in the sense of transitioning to someone or something entirely post-human. And indeed, there exists an enduring legacy of both utopian and eschatological narratives in the Western history of human storytelling. I've said that earlier. Let me just add that when we look at it, it's easy to observe that the humanist tradition, in fact, has been responsible for many of these eschatological tales, and it has also been responsible for their most recent transformation, or if you want, secularization. And speculations on future technologies have appropriated the tradition of eschatology, and it has secularized it. Such has been, in particular, the case in areas such as artificial intelligence, but such has also been the case in areas such as molecular nanotechnology and even biotechnologies. And here, the belief is that new technological advancements in biotechnology, in nanotechnology, in genetic engineering, offer the possibility of redesigning human nature, of completely transcending the limitations of human physicality, and of remedying nature's unfortunate mistakes. And I think that underlying this belief is, of course, a perennial aspiration. The perennial aspiration is that humans will no longer be controlled by nature. The hope is that technology will ultimately offer a path to immortality, that technology will disrupt or it will suspend the secular temporalities of death itself. Thus, in cryonics, you see how medical legally dead bodies are stored at liquid nitrogen temperatures. They are stored in suspended animation in the hope that future science may be able to reanimate them. Here we are back to the question of animation and reanimation. And since secular endings are final, that is, there's no time after life, continuity as a secular project has had, I think, to be constantly reimagined and reinscribed in other terms. So where does this leave us in terms of what we could call the politics of suspension in the age of biotech? My answer would be that the politics of suspension in the age of biotech is indeed that kind of project which involves the constant and ongoing technoscientific translation of life into time. Or rather, of translation of chronically incomplete lifetimes into promise-bearing forms of future life. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. I could have added one last thing, one other last example, which is the belief that human reason itself is rather limited and that we need to outsource it to the technological realm. How? By creating artificial general intelligence. Or the other belief, which is that in order to prevent the extinction of human civilization, in order to secure our own survival, human beings might exist post-biologically. They might exist in a digital realm. And this existence in the digital realm, they call it cyber immortality, is seen in fact by many as the final telos of human existence. The integration of humanity within the technological sphere. The final reconciliation of the human and of the technological. And you see it at work in attempts to scan a mental state and the wider neurological network to which it belongs, the ambition to copy it into digital devices, a story of which which is accounted for by Sandberg and Bostrom in a book called Whole Brain Emulation. The idea being that we need to take, one can take a particular brain, scan its structure in detail, construct a software model of it, a software model that is so faithful to the original that when run on appropriate hardware, it will behave in essentially the same way as the original. So look, let me summarize all of this and stop. Now, what we have done is that we have gone through a really long journey. It might have sounded tortuous, but it's because of the complexity of the issue we're dealing with. We took sustenance in a variety of archives, as I call them. We looked into the resources made available to us by, quote unquote, Western thought, in any case, some traditions of Western thought, but we also drew sustenance from what are called African pre-colonial metaphysics. Somebody else would have done that with other metaphysics, ontologies from other parts of the world. But for this case, I thought that it was important to enrich our problematization by playing with key concepts in African metaphysics. And we ended up with fundamentally elements of the Judeo-Christian tradition, especially during our discussion on futurism, technological futurism, contrasting it with considerations in particular by Ernst Bloch and his major work on the principle of hope. So I want to summarize all of that in order to make sure that our next and last session is devoted fundamentally to a conversation. What is it that you have heard from the series of 3 lectures? What do you make of it? How can you run with it? What are its limits? So what I'm saying is that for our last session, you will have to drive it. It will be up to you to drive it by revisiting some of the hypotheses I have shared with you, which are part of an ongoing work, and we'll take it from there. But let me end then. We started with our series with Agamben, with Jean-Luc Nancy, Esposito. Idea being, okay, to look into how it is that critical theory can make sense in times of a pandemic like the one we are still in, which is far from being over, because new variants are being discovered, as here in South Africa, where they have discovered yet a new variant, resulting in South Africa now being shunned from basically the rest of the world. Since now we are really in confinement, we can't go anywhere in the world. So it's not finished. So the point is that humanity, whatever we mean by it, clearly has been a constant, sometimes blind force in the history of the living world. Not talking about the history of the human world, but the history of the living world. And to achieve its project of universal domination, because that is what it was about. To achieve this project and to do it once for all, humankind has imagined that all it had to do was to harness the force of water, the force of the wind, the force of metals, fuels, radioactive materials, and so forth and so on. To harness these forces, salvation on earth, meaning the achievement of a kind of freedom never seen before, but a freedom through the machine. That the machine would save us, would set us free. And as a result, we have sought to relentlessly liberate ourselves from natural and organic environments instead of consciously making room for them. And in so doing, we have charted a Dionysian course in our history. We have done so to the extent that we are now struggling to understand the difference between the beginning and the end. We do not know any longer what is the beginning and what is the end. What are the means? What pertains to the realm of the means and what pertains to the realm of the ends? So it seems to me that technological futurism has, as a consequence, been interpreted within this long history of the matter-spirit conflict. The matter-spirit struggle. And when we look carefully, we read carefully Western metaphysics. In Western metaphysics, this struggle, which is more than just an interaction, is a fight. This struggle and endpoint, and its endpoint must be the abolition of nature. And when we say the abolition of nature, we're not necessarily talking about the subsumption of the human into nature. We're talking about the abolition, the erasure of nature, the final victory over nature. And I use the term nature here. I should, in fact, be using the term of the living, le vivant, with which we started with. But as you know, the question of the end point, that's what eschatology is all about. That is what the apocalypse is all about. The starting point being, of course, the belief. When you read the book of the Apocalypse, or when you study the various theologies of eschatology, especially in Christianity, but other monotheistic religions too, the starting point is always the belief in some kind of final transformation, which is very different from the paradigm we were playing with in African metaphysics, which had to do with the permanent regeneration of the life cycle. So you see the difference between a position which begins with the idea that life has to be constantly repaired. It has to be constantly replenished. It has to be constantly reanimated. That the air, breath, has to be constantly inhaled and exhaled for life to continue. You have that. And on the other hand, the belief in some kind of final transformation of this living world. And the fact is that this living world, just as the human in it, must reach at some point, I mean, that's the belief, that it must reach at some point the apex of its evolution. And therefore, the idea that technology is one way in which we reimagine the landscape of possibilities of this final transformation of the living world. So it seems to me that we have here, let's say, a kind of anthropocentric focus of this imagination, its radical focus on humanity and on the idea of the separateness of humanity. And in the African traditions, something completely different. Something premised on the possibility of resonance and of reciprocal vibration. Which was then delegitimized as a mode of thinking of so-called primitive people. But what we see nowadays, through a set of new forms of thinking, ecological theories, feminist theories, the new voyages, planetary voyages of critical thought, what we see is an attempt, not necessarily at rehabilitating those forms of knowledge that were dismissed and violated. And it's not about rehabilitation. It's about the fact that the current landscape of life, of the living world, calls upon us to invent new ways of living with, let's say, of hosting life, repairing it, in the process, repairing the earth, learning how to share it, all of this as a precondition for its sustainability and ours. So that's where I'll leave it. That's why the argument was that, of course, Agamben and the others are interesting, but they might be leading us into a cul-de-sac for lack of having interrogated radically the premises of the thought, the kind of eschatological vision, which presupposes the existence somewhere of an omega point. So I will leave it at that for today.